Hi everybody and welcome to another exciting edition of Boring JavaScript. I'm your host, the Virtuoid, aka MacBeth, and today we're going to be talking about intersection observers. Intersection observers observe when one particular DOM element intersects with another DOM element. For example, let's suppose you had a web page that had analytics, and it was a very long web page and you want to find out if somebody scrolled to the very bottom of the screen. What you will then do is set up an intersection observer to observe if that one particular DOM element goes into the viewport of your screen. When that happens, you send out the analytics. And that way, you know that somebody has scrolled all the way down to see a particular piece of information on your screen. And that's all intersection observers do. They're very easy to set up, very easy to use, and they're wonderful things. You want to see how they work? Let's get started. So what I have here is an HTML file that I'm going to do my intersection observer on. I happen to have Act 1, Scene 2 of MacBeth. And within this file, I have two different sections. First of all, I have the actual story itself, and then way down at the bottom of the screen here, I've got some text in which I'm going to say, I cannot see Linux, or I can see Linux. Because the idea here is that within this entire script here, as you can see as we're rolling along here, there's only one piece of dialogue done by some dude named Linux, and there he is right there. So what I have done is I have tagged with an ID the div that contains the entire script for Act 1, Scene 2, and I have tagged the ID for Linux. So I'm going to use an intersection observer to know when this particular P element appears within the div story and when it disappears. Now, how will I know it's going to, how do I know whether it's there or not? Well, first of all, within the CSS, I have set my story to be a height of 20 and a width of 40 with an overflow scroll. Now, this thing is a great deal longer than 20 rem, so it's going to have a little scroll bar that will appear on the right-hand side, and I'm going to be using the scroll bar there to be able to scroll Linux in and out of view. So let's take a look at how the intersection observer works. That's it right there. Not much else to it. You create a new intersection observer, and it has two parameters. The first parameter is the callback function, which you want to call every time an event occurs, an intersection event occurs. The second argument is the options. And this options tells you how you're going to be able to, or how the intersection observer is going to interpret the intersection, or how it knows when an intersection has actually occurred. I guess that's the better way of doing it. So let's take a look at a couple of them here. First of all, the most important thing I need to pass to the intersection observer is I need to pass the root. And this root is basically what do I want to look for, what is the element in which I want to look into that my particular observation is going to occur. So let's go back to the HTML file. My observation is going to be Linux. I want it to occur within the story ID. So within the JavaScript, I'm going to say, hey, or within the options, I'm going to say, hey, story ID is the root. Anything outside the root I couldn't care less about, but within this root, what I'm going to be observing is going to have to occur within this root. If you want to do the entire document, we just pass document here, or document body. I think would probably be a better one. Threshold of 1 basically says that 100% of the element must appear within the root for it to trigger an event. So in this case, what I would expect is that once I scroll to Mr. Linux here, if I just get this much on the screen, it's not going to fire. I've got to get all of this on the screen before it fires. I'm also got to get all of that off the screen before it fires again to say it's not there. Now, can I change it to anything else? Sure, I can put a 0.5 there for saying half of the article needs to be there. I can put a 0.25 for saying 25%. I can even give it an entire range. There's a lot of different options you can do here. You can look at the Mozilla Developer Network to tell you all the different options that you can put into these options, or the different settings that you can put into these options for the intersection observer. In this case, I'm going to keep it real simple. I'm going to say, hey, 100% of the element must appear. Okay, so we got all that. We've got to tell it what element we are going to be looking at. And that's with this statement, line 30 down here. We call the observe method on that element. Because once we do the observe method, that basically says, hey, I want you to observe this element right here using this observer, which means I'm going to be looking for this element to 100% be within the viewport of this particular element right here, this root element right here. So now by doing the observe method here, this says, or this tells us that I want to look for Linux within the story ID. Can you have more than one observation? Sure. If I label each and every single one of these particular paragraphs, let me just flip back over here. If every single one of these were labeled for some reason, it will send a intersection observer request every time one of those P's occurs. Now I'm just keeping it real simple here, and I'm just doing my one Linux. So therefore, what happens when we call? Well, what happens is that we get the show hide Linux, or do the callback, in which case we do the show hide Linux. Since there could be more than one, it is passed always as an array. So I'm just, now I know I only have one observation, so I could just sit here and say, hey, my entry is the 0th element. I could always do that, but just for completeness sake, I'm doing the for each loop to be able to get each one of the entries. Although it's just, again, it's just going to do one. There's a lot of different options that are passed to, or a lot of different properties on this object that is passed over to you. The only one I'm really concerned about in this case is the isIntersecting flag. This isIntersecting flag is set to true if I happen to see 100% of the Linux P tag within my story div. If isIntersecting is false, that means I'm not seeing any part of it whatsoever. Which means basically what will happen is that the minute 100% of it gets in there, it's going to fire an event saying, hey, isIntersecting is true. The second it goes back off, it's going to fire off another event saying, hey, isIntersecting is false. So I now know that isIntersecting is going to always be the property in which, if it's true, it's on the screen. If it's false, it's off the screen. And so all I'm going to do is I'm just going to add my class. I'm going to change the class list on my seed Linux, which is this little button down here. I'm going to change it from no to yes, and I'm going to change the text to I can see Linux. Otherwise, if it is false, I'm going to change my yes to no, and I'm going to say I cannot see Linux. That's it. That is all it is going to do. There's nothing else really to it. So the key here is that intersection observer is the actual observer, but it does not do anything until we actually observe something. And we observe a DOM element to come within the visible range of the root element that we pass within the options. So, you want to see how it works? Let's flip back over to our browser. Here is our code. I'm just going to do Control F5 just to kind of get a fresh, clean copy here. And so here's our intersection observer. Here's our MacBeth Act 1 C1. Right now, as you can tell, it says I cannot see Linux. So I'm going to slowly scroll. And when Linux appears 100% within the story, oh, there it goes. Now look, oh, there he is. So it works great. If I take Linux back out, notice 100% is not there. So now it says I cannot see Linux. Oh, you can see. Oh, I can't see Linux. So what happens if I scroll off the top? Same thing. The second it does not go to 100%, it says I cannot see Linux in this particular case. And again, 100% because I set the threshold to 1. So that's basically all there really is to it. There's really not much else that you can do with the intersection observer, but it's very powerful in knowing when certain DOM elements are appearing within other DOM elements. Now, you want to see a practical example of where this can be used? We'll show you that next. Now, you've seen websites that when you're scrolling through a list, when you get to the bottom of the list, suddenly more items will appear on the list. A shopping site will do things like that. For example, if you're sitting there and you want to look for apparel, and you're looking at shirts, you scroll through the first 20 shirts, and when you get to the bottom, boop, another set of 20 appear. When you get to the bottom of that, boop, another set of 20 appear, and so on and so forth until you get to the end of the list. Well, that can be done many different ways, but one of the easiest ways to do it is with an intersection observer. Let me show you how that can be done. All right, let's take a look at see what we're doing. First of all, we're fetching out our animals. This happens to just be a simple little JSON file in which I've got 100 animals. I'm going to get the response, and the response is I'm just basically going to convert the response from a JSON over to an actual object that I can use, an array of objects. But this is where things are starting to be built. We're going to have a bunch of variables that we're going to be using to help us define the list of the animals, how many we currently have inside the list, and which elements are going to be our observable elements. And so our first two pieces are going to be the animals, which is a simple array, and last animal index, which will tell us how many animals are currently displayed on the screen. In this case, 0, because we haven't done anything yet. So after we have gotten the response, we then populate the table. So when we populate the table, we're going to set up a couple more variables which are going to become extremely important to us. The first one is going to be the animals, which we've already talked about, the last animal index. Last animal, which defaults to null, is going to be the DOM element that will be our observed element. So this will be basically the DOM element, or in this case it's going to be the row, as you'll see here in just a minute, that is going to represent the DOM element that we're going to be observing. We're also going to be setting up what's called a previous animal, and the previous animal will be the previous DOM element that we're observing. So why are we keeping the current DOM element we're observing and the previous one? I'll show you that in just a second here. All right, if the last element index is less than animal's length, then we know we have some more to be able to add. So first of all, we're going to set up our end data and start data to be able to figure out, what's our index numbers we're going to be grabbing from the JSON file. And so start data is going to, very first time through, start data is going to be 0, while end data is going to be 10. Also notice I've also increased last number animal index to 10. So once we finish with this, last animal index is going to be 10, telling us that, hey, we've already done 10 animals. Then it's just a simple, I'm going to do the filtering, and I'm going to go through the for each, where I'm going to construct the TR and the TD, and I'm going to append it to the zoo list. But here's the important thing, last animal equals TR. So basically, once all this finishes up, last animal is going to be equal to the very last row that we have appended to this table. And so when we resolve, we're going to resolve the animals list, last animal index, which first time through is going to be 10, the last animal, which is going to be the very last TR, and then previous animal, which was going to be null. And again, I'll get to you later exactly what previous animal is going to do for us. Then we're going to save the data. This is where we transfer everything to the everything that we're going to use globally. In this case, we're going to save the animals. We're going to save last animal and last animal index. We're going to then get the previous animal, and we're just going to resolve last animal and previous animal. So I don't care now about animals or last animal index, but I do care about last animal and previous animal. Then finally, last thing we're going to do is prepare the observer. This is going to be the important part. So we're going to get the last animal and the previous animal. If there is a previous animal, then we're going to unobserve it. And this is very important, because let's assume that we've done our first 10 and we're observing the very final TR in that list, which is what last animal is. Once we now determine we've got to get another set of animals, we're going to now have 20 animals in the list. This is the first time through. So previous animal is going to be set to the old observed animal, while the last animal is going to be set to the new reserved animal. And all that occurred right here in the populate table. So what will happen is that we don't want to just continually observe items. So if we got the 10th animal, we observe that one, that's great. Then the 20th one, we observed that one, that was great too. So we're going to end up, if we don't unobserve anything, we'll end up with 10 different observations occurring, and everything's just going to be a big mess. So what I do is I want to be absolutely certain that I unobserve the old one. That's why we have that previous animal there. That's why we save what the last animal was once we populate the new table. So we're going to unobserve the old one, and we observe the new one. So now we're observing the very last element in the table. So when it appears within the table or within the viewport, then we populate another set of 10. And then we just resolve it, because I don't have to care about anything else. It doesn't really matter. I don't need anything else at that point. So what happens when we do get our intersection observer populated here? Our intersection observer is basically going to say, okay, I want to run the prepare to populate table routine when something has occurred using these options. And the options basically is the viewport. So if I sit over to the view HTML, here's my viewport. it contains this table. No big deal there. And I want a threshold of 1, which means I want that TR to appear all the time. So, in the prepare to populate table, all we do is we get our animal, which since we're only observing one animal at a time, I have animal's entry at 0. If it isn't intersecting, that means we have a new intersection. It means it appears within the viewport. Then we're going to call populate table with the animals, last animal index, and last animal. Because remember, first time through, last animal is going to be that 10th TR. The last animal index is going to be 10, and animals is going to be our list. And then we just do save data and prepare observer just like we did here. And that's pretty much it. So the idea here is that we observe that very last TR. When that very last TR appears inside of our viewport, then we read in the next 10, we unobserve the old TR and we observe the new TR. So now we have 20. When that comes into the list, we add 10 more. We unobserve the old TR and we reobserve the 30th TR, and so on and so forth till we get to 100. So you want to see how that works? Let's flip over. I'm just going to do a Control F5. So notice that we have 10 in there. We can only show 3 at a time. But notice how large the scroll bar is. So that basically says, you know, I definitely do not have 100 entries within this table. So as I scroll down here, you can tell I'm now halfway down my scroll bar and I'm only at number 5. So we're waiting for index number 9 to appear on the screen. Once it appears on the screen, I'm going to use my down arrow here so I can get my arrow out of the way. So I'm using the down arrow key. There's 8. There's 9. Oh, did you notice what happened to the scroll bar? It moved up. And the reason it moved up is because we've added 10 more. So if we scroll down, yep, there's number 10. And as soon as that scroll bar gets down to the bottom, that means we're at index number 19. You'll notice it jumped back up because we've added 10 more. Next one should do it, because notice 19 is not quite there. Remember, 100%. Boom! There we go. So that's how you can use the mutation observer to basically tell the computer or tell your application that, hey, I need to have more data within this table. That way you can just load in one section at a time, and if your customer doesn't care about, is finished with it, then they can go on and do something else. That way you don't have to load in a couple tens of thousands of different options. You just load in exactly what they need. And as they scroll down, you'll just keep loading more and more and more until you finish it out. In fact, we'll go ahead and finish it out here. That's 50, that's 60, that's 70, that's 80, that's 90, and that's 100. And notice it's not loading in any more whatsoever because I've got a little a check inside there that says, hey, we're all done. Now, in actuality, I didn't observe the final one. I should have, but I didn't. So doesn't really matter. Anyway, but as you can tell here, that's how you can use the intersection observer to get that effect to where you just load in a small bit of data, and as they scroll down, if it appears within the screen, load in more data. Wonderful way to do it. Like I said, there are other different ways to do it. Intersection observer is a great way of getting that particular effect. And that's everything there is on the intersection observer. I hope you enjoyed our video. Hope I didn't bore you to death. Please make sure you click on the like button below and subscribe to this channel by clicking on the subscribe button. Also, you can see all of our videos at www.boringjavascript.com. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you later.